first week of his long-awaited retirement should have been a time of celebration for Harold Bennett. After 40 years of sweat and sacrifice in an Ohio factory, he came home ready to share the news with his family. But instead of cheers, he was met with silence and then betrayal. Son Michael Bennett dropped his fork in disbelief, while his daughter-in-law Amanda leaned forward with cold precision. Michael's words landed like a hammer. "Dad, we don't need another mouth to feed in this house." It was a moment Harold never imagined. This was the same son whose college tuition he had worked double shifts to cover, the same young man whose wedding he had quietly financed. Yet now, Harold was being told he was a burden, a freeloader, a man with no place in his own family's home. Amanda quickly added fuel, suggesting Harold take a job, any job like stocking shelves or bagging groceries. But Michael had already decided his father would become a janitor at Whitman Industries, the very company where Michael proudly worked as a manager. Harold smiled faintly and agreed, though inside his heart burned. He had spent decades living, simply hiding the truth about his finances, even his influence. What his son and daughter-in-law didn't know was that Harold was far from helpless. And very soon, he would discover that underestimating him would be the costliest mistake of their lives. Harold Bennett sat in stunned silence at the kitchen table. It's the same table where he had celebrated birthdays, Christmas dinners, and milestones with his family. But tonight, the room felt colder, emptier, as if the laughter of the past had been erased in an instant. His son Michael stared at him with hard eyes, and his daughter-in-law, Amanda, crossed her arms like a judge passing sentence. "Dad, you can't just quit your job like that," Michael said, his voice sharp, almost managerial. "Do you realize what this means? You expect me to keep working 50 hours a week to pay the bills while you sit around all day?" Harold swallowed hard, the words stinging more than he wanted to admit. Sit around all day. Was that what they thought? Retirement? Was that what they thought of him? A man who had poured 40 years of his life into a factory so that Michael could have opportunities he never did? Amanda's voice cut in next, cool and deliberate. "My neighbor's father still bags groceries. At 73, you're 66, Harold, not 90. You can work. You should work. We can't afford another mouth to feed."
Another mouth to feed?
The phrase echoed in Harold's mind. He glanced down at the meatloaf on his platomida. Had made his favorite, but now it tasted like ashes. His chest tightened as he looked at his son, the boy he had taught to ride a bike, whose college loans he had quietly paid off, whose wedding day he had financed without complaint. He forced a thin smile. "You're right. Should have discussed it with you first." Michael leaned back, satisfied. "Exactly. Look, Dad, I'm not trying to be cruel, but reality is reality. You need a job, any job. Flipping burgers, stocking shelves, I don't care. But you're not living here for free." Harold nodded slowly, masking the storm raging inside him. He had spent decades working overtime shifts, sacrificing vacations, even selling his prized pickup truck just to make sure Michael had everything he needed. And now, here he was, being treated like a burden. That night, as Harold lay awake in his small bedroom at the back of the house, he overheard their whispers through the thin walls. "What if he refuses to work?" Amanda murmured. "Then we'll take his Social Security check and put him in a nursing home." Michael replied, his voice cold, practical, almost casual. "Enough already. I'm tired of supporting dead weight. Dead weight. Nursing home." The word struck Harold harder than any factory accident ever had. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the bedsheets, the betrayal cutting deep. For 2 years, since his wife Martha had passed, he had been trying to hold his family together. He thought living with Michael and Amanda was a way to stay close, to share meals, to feel part of something again. But to them, he was little more than an expense to be managed. And yet, beneath the sorrow, something else stirred in anger, cold and steady. The kind that comes not from impulse, but from decades of endurance. Michael thought his father was powerless. Amanda thought he was too old, too weak, too dependent. What neither of them knew was that Harold had been living modestly by choice, not necessity. While they assumed he scraped by paycheck to paycheck, Harold had quietly invested, planned, and built a safety net they knew nothing about. As he lay in the dark, memories flooded back. The double shifts he worked when Michael needed new textbooks. The second job he took on weekends to cover tuition at Ohio State. The night he paid the caterer at Michael and Amanda's wedding when their budget ran dry. They never knew the sacrifices he made because he never told them. He didn't want praise. He only wanted his family to have the life he never had. But now they had mistaken his humility for weakness. They had mistaken his kindness for helplessness. That was a mistake they would soon regret. Harold closed his eyes and let the anger harden into resolve. Tomorrow he would play the role of the obedient father. He would nod, smile, even accept the humiliating job his son arranged. But deep inside, he was already making plans. Plans that would remind Michael and Amanda of exactly who he was, and show them the true cost of underestimating Harold Bennett. The following morning, Harold Bennett entered the kitchen with a calm smile on his face. Michael sat at the counter, sipping coffee, while Amanda buttered toast with the smug satisfaction of someone who believed they had one. "I've been thinking about what you said last night," Harold began, his voice measured. "You're right. A man my age should contribute to the household. I'll take a job. Honest work is honest work." Michael's eyebrows shot up. Amanda froze, her knife hovering mid-spread. They had expected resistance, maybe even begging. Instead, Harold gave them surrender, or at least what looked like it. "Well, good," Michael said, leaning back, his tone dripping with authority. "That's exactly the attitude we wanted to see. I think I have just the thing. There's a janitor position open at Whitman Industries, minimum wage, of course. But like we said last night, beggars can't be choosers." Amanda chuckled softly, as if the phrase tasted sweet on her tongue. Harold nodded politely, hiding the fire in his chest. Beggars can't be choosers. They had no idea who they were talking to. "That sounds perfect," Harold replied, meeting his son's eyes directly. "I accept." Amanda reached across the table and patted his hand in mock sympathy. "See? That wasn't so hard. You just needed to face reality." Reality. If only they knew. By Monday morning, Michael was positively beaming with self-importance. He laid out a uniform for Harold, a cheap set of work clothes, stiff and uncomfortable, the kind you'd buy at a discount store. He even placed a mop and bucket by the door, like props for a play. "This is your new start," Michael said, his voice taking on the tone of a manager speaking to a low-level employee. "Show up at 7 o'clock sharp. Follow orders. No complaints." Harold nodded again, the picture of compliance. But as he looked down at the mop, he thought of the irony. The building he was about to clean, he had helped fund its very foundation 25 years earlier. Whitman Industries wasn't just a place of employment, it was his company, his investment, his legacy. That night as Harold lay in bed, he could hear the smug whispers from the other side of the wall. "Finally, he's doing something useful," Amanda said. "It's about time," Michael replied. "By tomorrow, Dad will understand who runs this house. He'll know his place." Harold closed his eyes, and for the first time in days, a smile tugged at his lips. He wasn't angry anymore, wasn't even hurt. No, now he was patient, calm, almost amused. They believed they were putting him in his place. What they didn't realize was that Harold had spent his entire life mastering patience, playing the long game, and building something far bigger than either of them could comprehend. When Monday morning came, Michael was jittery with excitement. He drove Harold to Whitman Industries, lecturing him the whole way. Asterisk, no excuses today. "Dad, you show up, you mop floors, you keep your head down. If you mess this up, you'll embarrass me, and I won't stand for it." Harold only smiled faintly. "Don't worry, son. Today everything will be different." Michael shot him a suspicious glance, but said nothing more. They pulled into the gleaming parking lot of Whitman Industries, the glass facade of the building reflecting the early Ohio sunlight. Thousands of employees streamed inside, completely unaware that a quiet storm was brewing. Michael thrust the mop into his father's hands, as if crowning himself king over the old man. "Remember," he said sternly, "I do the talking, you just look grateful." Harold nodded, stepping into the lobby, his worn shoes clicking softly against the polished marble floor. To every onlooker, he was just another elderly man in a janitor's uniform. But deep inside, he carried the calm authority of someone who knew the truth. This building stood because of him. Without his investment, there would be no Whitman Industries. No jobs for thousands of people, no paycheck for Michael. Michael mistook his father's silence for submission. But Harold knew better. This was just the beginning. Soon, his son and daughter-in-law would learn the difference between weakness and restraint, between poverty and chosen simplicity. And when that truth finally came to light, they would understand too late that underestimating Harold Bennett was the biggest mistake of their lives that night. After Michael and Amanda went to bed, Harold Bennett lay awake in his small bedroom at the back of the house. The walls were thin, and though he usually tried to tune out their nightly conversations, something in Michael's tone caught his ear. He turned toward the wall, straining to hear. "He thinks he can just sit here living off me." Michael's voice carried clearly through the drywall. "Retirement doesn't mean he gets to freeload for the rest of his life." Harold's jaw tightened. Freeload. Was that truly how his son saw him? Amanda's reply was lower, but just as sharp. What if he refuses to keep working? What if he just sits around all day watching TV, eating our food? Michael gave a humorless laugh. "Then we'll take his Social Security check and put him in a nursing home. I've had it. I'm not carrying dead weight anymore." Dead weight. Nursing home. Harold gripped the bedsheet, his knuckles turning white. Every syllable felt like a blade twisting deeper into his chest. This was his son, the boy he had worked double shifts for. The young man whose education he had sacrificed decades of health and comfort to pay for. Now talking about discarding him like yesterday's trash. Amanda wasn't finished. "He's been mooching off us ever since your mom passed. Free meals, no rent, no bills, and now he wants to quit working altogether? He has no shame? Mooching, no shame." Harold closed his eyes, his mind flashing with memories. The $40,000 he'd scraped together for Michael's college tuition. The $12,000 he had quietly slipped into Michael's wedding fund to cover the caterer. The flowers, the honeymoon. All the times he went without brown-bagging lunches, patching his old coat, skipping vacations just so Michael could have more. And yet, here they were, laughing in the dark, mocking the man who had given them everything. Amanda's voice dropped to a whisper, but Harold caught every word. "Maybe we give him 1 week. If he doesn't get the job or starts slacking, he's out. Let him see what it's like to fend for himself. Beggars can't be choosers, right?" Their laughter drifted through the wall, casual and cruel. Harold lay still, every muscle in his body tense, his heart pounding in his chest. He had never felt so utterly betrayed. He had always believed that sacrifice bred gratitude, that his son would one day look back and realize the depth of his father's love. But instead, Michael and Amanda saw him only as an expense to manage, a burden to eliminate. For a long time, Harold just stared at the ceiling, the shadows of passing headlights moving across the plaster. He thought of his old co-workers, men who had been honored with retirement parties, gold watches, fishing trips, or family celebrations. He thought of his late wife, Martha, who had always reminded him that kindness and humility were strengths, not weaknesses. But tonight, Harold realized that kindness had been mistaken for helplessness. Humility had been mistaken for weakness, and in that quiet, something inside him shifted. The sorrow and disbelief hardened into something colder, sharper, steady, calculating anger. Not the wild fury of a younger man, but the measured resolve of someone who had spent a lifetime learning how to endure, how to wait for the right moment to strike. Michael thought he held all the power now. Amanda thought she could dictate his future. They both believed Harold was powerless, dependent, trapped, but they didn't know the truth. They didn't know about the investments Harold had made decades earlier, the quiet fortune he had built while living modestly. They didn't know that. The very company Michael worked for, Whitman Industries, stood because of Harold's support all those years ago. Harold exhaled slowly, the beginnings of a plan forming in his mind. If they wanted to see him humbled, he would play along. He would let them believe they had one. He would wear the uniform, carry the mop, nod obediently when Michael barked orders. But beneath that quiet act, Harold would set the stage. He would remind his son and Amanda that the man they dismissed as dead weight was far from helpless. Tomorrow, they would see the mask of compliance, but soon enough, they would see the truth. And when that day came, it wouldn't just be about revenge. It would be about respect, dignity, and the lesson Michael had clearly never learned. A father's worth is never measured in dollars, but in sacrifices, and those sacrifices deserve gratitude, not scorn. Harold closed his eyes, a faint smile touching his lips, despite the sting in his chest. The game had begun, and this time, he would make sure his son understood exactly who Harold Bennett really was. Harold Bennett rose early the next morning, not because he slept well, but because his mind refused to rest. As the house remained quiet, he poured himself a cup of black coffee and settled into the worn armchair by his bedroom window. The anger from the night before was still there, but it had transformed into something more useful: clarity. For decades, Michael and Amanda had believed Harold lived paycheck to paycheck, barely scraping by on his factory wages. And why wouldn't they? He'd let them believe it. He'd lived modestly, rarely bought anything new, and never bragged about money. To them, he was the tired old man who spent 40 years clocking in at the plant. But they didn't know the truth. Back in the late 1990s, when Whitman Industries was nothing more than a dream in Richard Whitman's garage, Harold had been one of the first to believe. Richard was younger then, ambitious but struggling, his eyes filled with plans too big for his bank account. Harold, who had quietly saved over the years, saw something in him that others didn't. With little fanfare, he wrote a check for $600,000, structured as a loan to avoid complications. They shook hands right there, surrounded by dusty tools and blueprints. That handshake changed everything. Whitman Industries grew, and with it, Harold's stake grew too. The modest loan had been converted into equity, and over time, Harold became a 38% shareholder in a company that now employed thousands across the Midwest. His dividends alone had been enough to live comfortably, far more than the factory job ever paid. But Harold never flaunted it. He let his son believe he was just an ordinary man, a laborer with no real wealth, no hidden influence. It wasn't deception born of cruelty, it was a test of character. Harold wanted to know what kind of man Michael would become without the lure of money. Would he learn respect, humility, gratitude, or would he become entitled, arrogant, blind to the sacrifices made for him? Now Harold had his answer, he thought. Back to the late nights when Michael panicked over rising tuition at Ohio State. "Don't worry, son," Harold had reassured him. "Your old man will figure it out." What Michael never knew was that Harold didn't scrape the money from overtime shifts alone. Much of it came from the steady dividends of Whitman Industries, quietly funding his son's education. He remembered Michael's wedding to Amanda in her satin gown, Michael grinning ear to ear in his rented tuxedo. They believed it was all possible because of careful budgeting, because of friends chipping in. But it had been Harold who paid. The extra $12,000 when costs spiraled. Harold who covered the caterer. Harold who made sure the music played and the lights stayed on. And yet they sat in the next room laughing about nursing homes, calling him dead weight. The irony nearly made Harold chuckle. Michael worked at Whitman Industries, strutted through its hallways, and collected a paycheck every 2 weeks never. Realizing his father had been one of the men who built the very foundation of that company, his position, his salary, the sense of importance, all of it existed because Harold had believed in Richard Whitman's dream decades earlier. Harold took another sip of coffee, the bitterness grounding him. "They think I'm powerless," he thought. "They think I'm dependent. But every dollar they've ever leaned on me for came from the very wealth they don't know exists." He rose from his chair and opened the small cedar box he kept hidden in the back of his dresser drawer. Neatly stacked folders, copies of share certificates, investment documents, and correspondence with Richard over the years. Proof not just of Harold's stake, but of his quiet influence in one of the region's largest companies. Running his fingers over the papers, Harold felt the weight of decades settle on his shoulders, not as a burden, but as armor. He was no helpless old man. He was a businessman, a provider, and a man who had deliberately chosen simplicity so his family could grow. But now, with his son's betrayal echoing in his ears, Harold realized something. His modesty had protected Michael from arrogance. When He was young, but as an adult, it had enabled entitlement. His silence had been mistaken for weakness. Sacrifice had been twisted into obligation. That would end now. Harold placed the papers back into the cedar box, locking it with care. He wasn't ready to reveal everything, not yet. Timing mattered. For now, he would continue to play the obedient father, the humbled retiree who accepted the janitor job with a grateful smile. Let Michael and Amanda believe they had control. Let them laugh while they could, because soon enough, they would learn that Harold Bennett was no extra mouth to feed. He was the man who had fed them all along. And when the truth came out, their smug certainty would shatter. That night, Harold Bennett sat at his desk long after Michael and Amanda had gone to bed. A single lamp cast a warm circle of light across the papers he had pulled from his cedar box. For the first time in years, he wasn't just reflecting, he was planning. He reached for a fresh notebook and drew 3 columns across the page. At the top he wrote, "What they know, what they don't, what I want them to think." The first column he listed the obvious. They knew he had retired. They believed he had no savings, and they assumed he was entirely dependent on their goodwill. In the second column, Harold wrote with steady, deliberate strokes. They didn't know about his 38% ownership in Whitman Industries, his dividend checks, or the separate bank accounts Martha had once helped him set up. They didn't know about the vacation property deeded in his name, or the his box he kept at the post office downtown. They didn't know he'd spent years quietly securing independence. And in the third column, he smiled as he wrote, "I want them to think I am powerless, that I am grateful. They have one." It was a strategy born of decades on the factory floor and years investing in business with Richard Whitman. Harold had learned long ago that power was never about shouting the loudest. Real power was about patience, positioning, striking only when the time was right. The next morning, Harold drove into town, claiming he needed to pick up prescriptions. Instead, he opened a small post office box in his own name. This would become his private address, a safe place for correspondence that Michael and Amanda would never see. He also met briefly with his attorney and old friend named Peter Alvarez, who had handled his estate paperwork for years. "Pete," Harold said quietly, "I need some things updated." Discreetly. The lawyer didn't ask questions. He just nodded, sliding a stack of forms across the desk. "We'll make sure everything is airtight." By afternoon, Harold had already arranged for his dividend payments to route into a separate account, one Michael could never touch. He also contacted Anna, the caretaker for the small lakeside property Martha had loved. They hadn't spoken in years, but her voice warmed when she heard from him. "Mr. Bennett, it's been too long. Everything at the cabin is still in fine shape. When will you be visiting?" "Soon," Harold replied with a smile. "Very soon." Back at the house, Harold carried himself with a quiet humility. When Michael asked if he was ready for his janitor job, Harold nodded obediently. When Amanda reminded him not to embarrass them, Harold offered a soft "of course." But inside, he was already several moves ahead. That evening, Michael came home with his lawyer friend, a sharp-talking man in a tailored suit. They sat Harold down in the living room, speaking to him as though he were a child. "Mr. Bennett," the lawyer began, "your retirement changes things financially. It may be best if your son helps you manage your accounts, your pension, and your Social Security benefits." Michael chimed in quickly. "Dad, it's not that we don't trust you, but handling money at your age can be overwhelming. Let us take the responsibility." Harold lowered his eyes, letting them believe he was defeated. "If that's what you think is best," he murmured. Michael smiled, believing victory was his. Amanda squeezed his hand in approval, but Harold's mind was elsewhere. He remembered Martha's words, written in a letter she had left for him before her passing. "If they ever treat you as less than the man you are, remember what you've built. Protect yourself. Protect your dignity." That night, Harold boxed up every personal belonging of Michael and Amanda that still lingered in the house college trophies, wedding gifts, even some of Amanda's old keepsakes. He labeled each box carefully, returning what belongs to you, keeping what belongs to me. The next morning, he arranged for movers to deliver the boxes directly to their doorstep. He didn't say a word about it, simply waited for the inevitable. confrontation. Sure enough, Michael stormed into the kitchen later that evening, his face red with anger. "What the hell was that, Dad? Sending our stuff back like we don't belong here." Harold looked at him calmly. "I just wanted to make sure you knew where the lines were. What's yours is yours. What's mine is mine," Michael spluttered, fist clenching, but Harold didn't flinch. For the first time in years, he felt something shift inside him, not fear, not anger, but control. The man they thought was powerless was slowly reclaiming his ground, and deep down, Harold knew this was only the beginning. The following Saturday, Harold Bennett was seated at the kitchen table with his morning coffee when Michael arrived home. Not alone this time, but flanked by his lawyer friend Tom Reynolds, was slick-tailored. Suit, polished shoes, and a voice that carried the kind of practiced authority meant to intimidate. Amanda trailed in behind them, arms folded, her expression smug. Harold set down his mug, bracing himself. "Dad," Michael began, pulling out a chair across from him. "We need to have a serious discussion about your future." Harold leaned back, silent, letting them believe they were in charge. Tom slid a folder across the table. "Mr. Bennett, retirement is a big transition. Michael and Amanda have legitimate concerns. Financially, it's unwise for you to manage things alone at your age. With their help, your pension and Social Security can be handled responsibly. All you'd need to do is sign a few authorizations." Harold opened the folder, glanced at the paperwork, then closed it again with calm finality. "So you want me to hand over control of everything I've worked for? Is that it?" Michael leaned forward, his voice sharpening. "Dad, stop being dramatic. We're not taking anything from you. We're trying to help you. But you can't just sit here doing nothing while I carry all the weight," Amanda chimed in, her tone icy. "You should be grateful we're even offering. Most people your age are already in assisted living." The words hung in the air like poison. Harold felt the sting, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he looked straight at his son. "Michael, let me be clear. I've supported you your entire life, college, your wedding, even the roof over your head right now. If you think that makes me a burden, then you don't understand what sacrifice means." Michael's face reddened. "This isn't about the past. This is about now. We need to be realistic. You're 6. You don't have the strength or the income to live independently anymore." Harold let a pause stretch, then said softly, "You're wrong about that. But if this is what you think of me, then here are my conditions. I will not sell this house. I will not sign over my accounts. I will not be treated like a child in my own home." Tom frowned, sensing the conversation slipping out of his control. "Mr. Bennett, I strongly advise you to reconsider. Without their support, your options are limited." Harold's eyes hardened. "You call this support? Threatening? Me with nursing homes and legal documents?" He stood, his frame steady, his voice gaining strength. "I've been underestimated before, gentlemen. It never ends well for the ones doing the underestimating," Amanda scoffed, but there was a flicker of unease in her eyes. Michael slammed his hand on the table. "Dad, stop playing games. You need us more than we need you. Don't forget that." Harold simply shook his head. "No, son. You've got it backward. You need me more than you realize." The room fell into a tense silence. For the first time, Michael faltered, unsure of his father's meaning. He had always assumed Harold was powerless, clinging to scraps of dignity. But in that moment, Harold's calm certainty unsettled him. Finally, Tom cleared his throat. "We'll revisit this later. For now, just think it over." They gathered their things and left, the sound of the front door slamming reverberating through the quiet house. Harold returned to his chair, lifted his coffee, and allowed himself the smallest smile. The confrontation had gone exactly as he expected. They believed he was cornered, but he knew better. They were tightening the noose around their own necks without even realizing it. Later that afternoon, Harold received a letter from his attorney, Peter Alvarez, confirming that his assets were fully protected and untouchable. Michael and Amanda could demand all they wanted, but legally, they had no ground to stand on. As Harold read the letter, he felt a wave of peace wash over him. The trap was no longer around. His neck it was around. And soon they would discover just how costly their arrogance had become. For now, though he played his role the quiet, compliant father who appeared to be slowly giving in. But inside, Harold was steel. I had weathered factory floors, night shifts, in the slow grind of sacrifice for decades. He knew how to endure. He knew how to wait. And when the time was right, Michael and Amanda would finally see that the man they dismissed as dead weight was the one holding all the cards. Asterisk, the next week brought Harold Bennett a sense of quiet assurance he hadn't felt in years. A thick envelope arrived at his post office box, sealed with his attorney Peter Alvarez's mark. Inside were the documents he had been waiting for, confirmation of his full inheritance rights to Martha's estate, along with updated protections. For his own assets, Harold sat at the kitchen table that evening with the papers spread neatly before him. Each signature and seal was like a shield, layers of protection against the schemes of his own son and daughter-in-law. Michael and Amanda could plot all they wanted, but legally their hands were tied. His accounts were safe, his investments secured, and the lakeside cabin Martha had loved was fully in his name. For the first time in weeks, Harold allowed himself to breathe. That night, as the house grew quiet, Harold pulled out 3 cardboard boxes from the storage closet. On the front of each, he taped a label he had written in his careful, steady hand. Go, stay, travel. Into the first box, marked Go, he placed Michael's old baseball trophies, his college yearbooks, and the wedding album Amanda had left on the bookshelf. He added some of Amanda's kitchen gadgets that she rarely used but claimed as hers, along with a few other personal items they had scattered throughout the house. These weren't his, they were theirs, and it was time they had them back. The second box, labeled STAY, he filled with his own belongings, photographs of Martha, the pocket knife his father had given him, the flag from his brother's military, funeral. These were pieces of his life, his history. It belonged to this house, no matter what Michael thought. The third box, travel, held only the essentials. Clothes neatly folded, a stack of personal documents, Martha's letters, and a small framed picture of her from their honeymoon in Florida. This was the box Harold would take when the time came to leave to retreat to the lakeside cabin, perhaps even further if he chose. When the boxes were sealed, Harold felt a strange calm settle over him. Was organizing out of choice, and choice was power. The next morning, he arranged for a local moving service to deliver the Go box to Michael and Amanda's doorstep across town. He didn't add a note of apology or explanation. Instead, he wrote a single line in bold black marker, returning what belongs to you, keeping what belongs to me. By late afternoon, Michael stormed through the front door of Harold's home. His face flushed red. Amanda followed, her lips pursed tight. "What the hell was that, Dad?" Michael shouted, slamming the cardboard box onto the table. "Sending our things back like we don't belong here." Or Harold looked at him evenly. "I just thought it was time to separate what's yours from what's mine. That way, there's no confusion." Amanda's voice dripped with disdain. "You're being petty, Harold. We're trying to help you, and this is how you repay us." Harold. "Didn't flinch help? You mean taking my pension? Planning to ship me off to a nursing home?" "No, Amanda. This isn't about help. It's about control. And I'm done being managed." Michael's fists clenched at his sides, his face red with fury. "You can't talk to us like that. You don't have the right." Harold leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but steady. "I've earned every right, son. I built this life. Paid for your education. I paid for your wedding. I even paid for the roof over your head. Don't stand there and tell me I don't have the right to claim what's mine." For a moment, Michael faltered. The authority in Harold's tone was unmistakable. It wasn't the voice of a frail old man. It was the voice of a father reclaiming ground that should never have been lost. Amanda tugged at Michael's arm. "Let's go," she hissed. "He's just trying to provoke us." But Harold didn't need to provoke them. He'd already drawn the line. When the door finally slammed shut behind them, Harold sat back in his chair, letting the quiet return. The house, once filled with tension, now felt lighter. He wasn't afraid anymore. He was prepared. The boxes on the floor were more than just cardboard. They were symbols of choice. Michael and Amanda could rage. They could threaten. But Harold had reminded them that he was not theirs to manage. He was his own man, still standing, still strong, and as he glanced at the travel box tucked neatly by his bedroom door, Harold knew the next step was coming soon. Very soon his children would learn that the man they had mocked as dead weight was about to move in ways they could never anticipate. The knock on the door came like thunder, though Harold Bennett had been expecting it all afternoon. I set aside the newspaper and rose slowly, his joints stiff but his mind sharp. When he opened the door, Michael was standing there, face flushed crimson, fists clenched tight at his sides. Amanda hovered a step behind, her expression a mixture of outrage and unease. "You think this is funny, Dad?" Michael stormed past him into the living room, slamming the door behind him. "Sending our stuff back like that?" To prove, Harold closed the door gently, deliberately, then turned to face his son. "I wasn't trying to prove anything. Just thought it was time you had back. What's yours? That I kept what's mine." Act. Michael slammed his hand against the box sitting on the coffee table, the same one Harold had sent earlier. "Don't play games with me. You're acting like this house is yours. You forget who pays the bills around here." Lee Harold's eyes narrowed, though his voice remained calm. "No, son, I haven't forgotten. They'd forgotten who made those bills possible in the first place." Amanda stepped forward, her voice sharp. "You're being dramatic, Harold. We're just trying to help you, and you're making it difficult. Just why are you so ungrateful?" "It's ungrateful." The word nearly made Harold laugh. He took a slow breath instead. "Ungrateful. I worked double shifts so Michael could go to college without debt. I sold my pickup so you could have your wedding catered properly. I gave you a roof when you couldn't afford one. Now you stand in my living room calling me ungrateful." For the first time, Michael faltered. His eyes darted to the floor, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. "That was years ago, Dad. Things are different now. You can't just live here without contributing." "Why?" Harold leaned forward slightly, his voice steady, deliberate. "I've contributed more to this family than you will ever realize. But here's the truth. I won't be threatened in my own home. I won't be bullied into giving up what I've earned. Not by you, not by anyone." The silence that followed was heavy. Amanda folded her arms, shifting uncomfortably. Michael's chest rose and fell with ragged breaths. He had expected his father to shrink, to cower the way he had during the first confrontation. Instead, Harold stood talcum, unwavering, a man who had nothing left to fear. "You can't keep this up," Michael muttered finally, his voice low, almost desperate. "You're making things harder than they need to be." Harold's reply came quiet, almost gentle. "No, son. You made things harder the moment you decided your father was nothing but dead weight. You showed me who you are. I've adjusted accordingly." Michael opened his mouth to respond, but found no words. Amanda tugged at his arm, whispering, "Let's go." Her confidence from earlier seemed to falter, as though she sensed a shift she couldn't explain. Michael lingered for a moment longer, glaring at his father, before finally snatching up the box and storming toward the door. "This isn't over." He spat. Harold gave a small nod. "You're right, it isn't." When the door slammed shut behind them, the house settled into quiet once again. Harold sank back into his chair, his heartbeat steady. For the first time in years, he felt no trace of fear. The power dynamic had shifted. Michael's fury had only exposed his weakness, anger born of losing control. Harold, on the other hand, had never been more in control. Every move he made was deliberate, calculated, and part of a larger plan. He had spent his life working, saving, and building. Now he was applying those same principles to the one battle that mattered most, reclaiming his dignity. As evening fell, Harold looked toward the travel box by his bedroom door. The moment was drawing closer, the day when he would no longer need to endure Michael and Amanda's hostility. For now, he had shown them that he would not be intimidated. Soon, he would show them something far more powerful, the truth about who he really was. And when that day came, they would finally understand that the man they had dismissed as a burden was the very foundation of everything they took for granted. Kitchen smelled of fresh-baked meatloaf, the kind Harold Bennett had always loved. He thought this dinner would be a celebration. Simple family moment marking the beginning of his retirement after 40 years on the factory floor. With a smile stretching across his face, he laid down his fork and announced softly, "Well, today was my last day at work. I'm finally retired." For a moment, silence hung heavy in the room. His son Michael dropped his fork with a loud clatter. His daughter-in-law Amanda froze mid-sip, her glass trembling slightly before she set it down hard against the table. "What?" Michael's voice rose sharply. "You quit, just like that. Do you even think about what this means?" Harold's smile faltered. He had pictured his son clapping him on the back, maybe Amanda raising her glass in a small toast. Instead, their eyes burned with annoyance. 40 years, son," Harold said carefully. "I've earned this. I thought we could celebrate together." Amanda's lips curled, her tone biting. "Celebrate? Harold, you think we're going to? Feed you for free? You're 66, not 90. Plenty of people your age work. My neighbor's father bags groceries at 73. The words hit Harold like cold rain. Feed him for free? Had his life of sacrifice, his decades of double shifts really come down to being labeled another mouth to feed? Michael leaned forward, his tone managerial, clipped. "Listen, Dad, I work 50 hours a week just to keep this household afloat. You're not going to sit here living off my paycheck. You need to find a job tomorrow. I don't care if it's flipping burgers or pushing a mop. You're not freeloading under my roof." Freeloader. The word stung. This was the boy he had raised, the young man whose college education he had quietly paid for, whose wedding he had covered when the bills came due. Yet here he was, staring at his father with eyes that saw only burden, not sacrifice. Harold lowered his gaze, swallowing the lump in his throat. "You're right. I should have discussed it with you first." Michael's shoulders relaxed slightly, taking his father's humility as surrender. "Good. I'm glad you understand. We're not trying to be cruel, Dad, but reality is reality. Reality." Harold forced a faint nod, but inside something cracked. He had always imagined retirement as a season of peace, filled with family dinners and quiet evenings. Instead, his son and daughter-in-law had reduced his worth to dollars and cents. Amanda gathered the plates briskly. "The sooner you find work, the better. This house can't carry dead weight." Harold sat quietly as they left the table, their voices rising cheerfully again in the living room as if nothing had happened. But for him, the world had shifted. 40 years of sacrifice, and his reward was to be called a burden by his own blood. Later that night, as Harold lay awake in his small bedroom, he turned those words over in his mind. Freeloader, dead weight, another mouth to feed. They thought he was powerless, trapped, dependent. But they were wrong. They didn't know the truth about the life he had built, investments he had made, the quiet strength he carried inside. And as Harold stared into the dark, a steady resolve settled over him. If Michael and Amanda wanted to see him humbled, he would let them for a time, but one day soon, they would learn exactly who he was and what he had done for them. And when that day came, it wouldn't just be about revenge. It would be about dignity restored. This story is a powerful reminder. Never mistake humility for weakness. Too often parents sacrifice everything for their children, only to be forgotten or dismissed. But age does not erase dignity, and love should never be repaid with contempt. To those watching, if you still have your parents, show them gratitude today. If you are a parent yourself, remember, your worth is not measured by what others think, but by the life you've built and the love you've given. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment below. Share your own experiences of sacrifice and respect. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that remind us of life's hardest lessons and most precious truths.